When An Duong Vuong emerged in the flow of history, he was not a ruler who destroyed Van Long, but one who recognized the limits of the Hung King's era. By this point, society had moved far beyond a loose tribal confederation. The population was larger, the living space wider, and threats were no longer isolated or sporadic. Security could no longer rely solely on forests, rivers, and autonomous villages. It demanded territorial thinking and centralized organization. The state of Au Lac was born from that realization. Unlike Van Long, where power was anchored in ritual, ancestry, and tradition, Au Lac operated through command, coordination, and systematic defense. An Duong Vuong was no longer a purely symbolic ruler. He became a central authority, the final decision-maker responsible for the survival of the entire community. The most visible expression of this transformation was the construction of Co Loa Citadel. This was not merely a military structure, it was a declaration of a new political mindset. Its spiral ramparts, moats, and controlled spaces reveal for the first time how ancient Vietnamese society physically anchored power into geography, turning the state into a tangible and defensible entity. Building Co Loa reflected a fundamental trade-off that Au Lac society was willing to accept. Communities were no longer completely autonomous, as they had been under Van Long. In exchange for security, they accepted discipline, large-scale labor mobilization, and obedience to centralized command. This was the price of survival in an era when history began to press directly against human existence. Yet beneath this newly concentrated structure of power, the spirit of Van Long endured. Ancestor worship, village-based social organization, and the rhythms of wet rice agriculture were not erased. An Duong Vuong did not create a civilization from nothing. He reorganized a civilization that had already reached maturity. It is precisely this balance that makes the era of An Duong Vuong so distinctive. It was not a violent revolution, but a strategic turning point. Ancient Vietnamese society was learning for the first time how to survive in a competitive regional landscape, one in which strength no longer came solely from internal harmony, but from the ability to prepare for conflict before it arrived. With new strength, however, came new tensions. As power concentrated at the center, distance emerged between the state and the village. Political decisions were no longer shaped entirely by communal consensus, but increasingly by strategy and command. This was an inevitable internal contradiction of all early states, a tension between collective tradition and centralized authority. Seen from the distance of millennia, the era of An Duong Vuong stands as the moment when Vietnam truly entered history in a political sense. From this point onward, the story was no longer only about adapting to nature, but about adapting to power, to rivals, and to existential choices. It was here that the long historical trajectory of Vietnam, defined by resilience, organization, and survival amid pressure, first took shape. This period did not mark the end of an ancient world, but the beginning of a far more demanding one. The era of An Duong Vuong did not begin with a dramatic overthrow, but with a slow awakening of history itself. When Van Long had fulfilled its historical role, ancient Vietnamese society reached a threshold where stability no longer meant safety. The familiar structures that had protected communities for centuries began to reveal invisible cracks. At this point, the ancient Vietnamese were neither impoverished nor culturally weakened. On the contrary, they had reached a stage of maturity. Wet rice agriculture had achieved long-term stability, the population had grown, villages expanded, and networks of exchange between regions became increasingly visible. Yet this very development created a new challenge: how to protect a community that had outgrown the traditional boundaries of its own security. During the Van Long period, security relied largely on geography and familiarity. Forests, rivers, swamps, and the strong internal cohesion of village life formed a natural defensive system. But as surrounding communities began to organize into more centralized political entities capable of mobilizing forces and waging planned warfare, those natural barriers were no longer sufficient. This was the moment when ancient Vietnamese political thinking was forced to change. Security could no longer rest solely on tradition. Power could no longer exist only as a symbol, and the community could not survive without the ability to respond quickly to organized external threats. In that historical context, An Duong Vuong emerged as not a conqueror, but as a reorganizer of order. He did not reject the legacy of Van Long, nor did he attempt to preserve it unchanged. What he represented was a historical choice: to accept transformation as the price of survival. The state of Au Lac was born from that choice. Compared to Van Long, it marked a major leap in political organization. Power was no longer fully dispersed among local Lac lords and chieftains. Instead, it became concentrated at a central authority capable of making strategic decisions for the entire community. This concentration of power was not merely administrative. It reflected a profound shift in how people understood the world around them. For the first time, the ancient Vietnamese clearly recognized that they were living within a competitive historical landscape, one in which survival depended on organization, coordination, and preparation for conflict. The clearest symbol of this new mindset was Co Loa Citadel. Co Loa was not simply a fortress, it was the physical declaration of an early state. Its spiral ramparts, water-filled moats, and multi-layered defensive system demonstrate a level of military and political thinking far beyond that of earlier periods. Constructing Co Loa required something Van Long never demanded on such a scale: centralized labor mobilization and strict social discipline. Tens of thousands of people had to work under unified command, following a common plan over an extended period. This was only possible once society accepted that the collective survival of the whole outweighed the absolute autonomy of individual communities. Yet this very transformation also gave rise to new tensions. As power concentrated, the distance between the center and local communities became more apparent. Decisions once shaped by custom and consensus were increasingly replaced by commands and strategic calculations. For many villages, this was not an easy trade-off. It was within this atmosphere of tension that the legends surrounding An Duong Vuong began to take shape and spread. Stories of the magical crossbow, betrayal, and the loss of the kingdom were not mere products of folklore. They reflected deep anxieties within a society confronting the fragility of centralized power. Unlike the Van Long era, where authority was inseparable from ancestors and cosmic order, power in Au Lac became more pragmatic but also more vulnerable. One's strength no longer rested entirely on tradition, it depended on people, on loyalty, secrecy, discipline, and trust. This form of power was inherently unstable. Still, it is crucial to emphasize that Au Lac did not sever itself from Van Long. Beneath the framework of a centralized state, village structures, ancestor worship, agricultural rhythms, and communal identity endured. The people did not become strangers to themselves, they simply adapted to a new political order. Viewed more broadly, the era of An Duong Vuong marks the first time the ancient Vietnamese truly entered regional history. From this point forward, they no longer existed in relative isolation, but became part of larger currents of power. The survival of the community was no longer determined solely from within, but increasingly shaped by external forces. This moment laid the foundation for all later Vietnamese history, a history defined by continuous pressure, conflict, and existential challenges, yet always striving to preserve its cultural core. That spirit did not originate in later dynasties, it began to take form during the time of An Duong Vuong and Au Lac.
If Van Long was the age in which people learned to live in harmony with nature and community, then Au Lac was the age in which they learned to organize in order not to be swept away by history. This was an irreversible turning point. From that moment on, Vietnamese history ceased to be a story of quiet continuity and became a story of life and death choices in the face of greater powers. For this reason, when we look back at the era of An Duong Vuong, we should not search only for battles or tragedies. What truly matters is recognizing this moment as the time that a civilization chose to transform itself in order to survive. And it was that choice that opened the long, difficult, yet resilient historical path of the Vietnamese people.
Thank you for your interest in the channel. I hope each video not only shares historical knowledge, but also helps you experience the depth, spirit, and cultural identity of Vietnamese history. If you find the content useful or have any suggestions for the channel or individual videos, please feel free to leave a comment. Your feedback will help improve future content. Enjoy the video, and see you in the next stories of Vietnam's history.